You are a historian. You are a historian of medicine and historian of science as well. And
Yes.
obviously, you're a researcher. You wrote a couple of books as well, and one is also forthcoming. What's the new book?
I have written one book and one is forthcoming. Yes. The new book the title is Disparate Remedies, Making Medicines in Modern India. And the book is an examination of medicines, medical culture, medical advertisements, and the practice of medicine, as well as its manufacture and distribution in British India from around 1880 to 1960. So it covers the period when India became a relatively young industrialized nation, but the fact we know that India is now a major manufacturer of pharmaceuticals in the present day, and in fact for the vaccine as well, the Indian franchise of the AstraZeneca vaccine is going to be manufactured by the ton and by Indian company, and this is the cheaper franchisee production that will be distributed all over the developing world. Africa, Asia, it will be developed. And India has been doing that, manufacturing generics at a much lower rate and selling them at a much lower rate than multinationals. And there has been a public, a discourse. In fact, it has become a conventional knowledge in political as well as in public discourse in the present day, that this is because of the liberalization, which is to say the restructuring of Indian economy and releasing it from government controls, including labor laws and the rest. But as my research shows, this is where I began. How is it that India becomes such a huge figure in pharmaceuticals manufacture? Is it research? Is it organization? What is it? Is it the very, very adaptability of Indian capital in the 20th century? But my research finds that it is support from government and the history of both government and nationalist industrialization, which were at parallel trajectories, but which were growing together in the British period, that provides the basis for this industry. And that provides the basis for Nehru to set it up even more substantially, because the first antibiotic manufacturing in India was in a public sector firm set up with the help of both the Soviets and American Merck. And although the American companies like Glaxo, Merck, they wanted to give antibiotics, manufacture antibiotics in India, but they wanted to keep the formula to themselves, whereas the Soviets gave the formula to Indians. So, and with some help from United Nations as well, from WHO and the Soviet, the first antibiotics manufacturing unit in India, Hindustan Antibiotics Limited, was set up in Pune, the very place in Pune where the vaccines are being manufactured. So it is not a coincidence. And I'm saying that the reason why India is such a huge manufacturer, it has this solid basis in knowledge, in capital, and not just technical knowledge, all kinds of other organizational knowledge to manufacture pharmaceuticals, is because the state supported this technology transfer, knowledge transfer, and the state supported the vision of health for all and the manufacture of medicines to be covered by government to a large extent, not completely, but to a large extent, so that it is available cheaply to everybody. So it is not because of privatization. It's not because of privatization in the 90s. It's a much longer history. Okay, sorry. I'm talking too much.
No, thanks for this good intro. I mean, without going for much spoiler for this forthcoming book, any astounding fact you actually found through your research, which you never thought, something, came as a shock?
I can say that it is, the most historically significant one is this. that Indian industry, the way Indian pharmaceutical industries today, is not because of private capital or enterprise, it's because of government support and technology transfer and education by the government, technical education. Okay, this is, historically, I think this is the most significant fact of the book. The most astounding is, it's less academic, but it might interest you more. The biggest Indian pharmaceutical manufacturers were also the biggest alcohol manufacturers. And they first made their money by producing alcohol, and not just industrial alcohol, because for medicines and for paint and dyes you need, but not just that, they were actually bottling alcohol for sale. And for most of the British period, the majority of their sales was not coming from the pharmaceutical unit. It was coming from the alcohol unit. So we owe a lot to alcohol drinking people. We should thank them for keeping the Indian pharmaceutical industry alive.
But can you also blame the British rule for our alcohol addiction?
See, blame British rule is, human beings will be addicted to something or other. Okay, life is hard. Now, you may not believe that you are you are a much more austere person than me. But I believe that we are all addicted to something or the other. Okay, and even if they're not material, then they're immaterial substances we are addicted to. Some people are addicted to knowledge, others are addicted to money, making money, others may be addicted to something else. So, but human beings will always use recreational substances, whether it is, in whatever form it comes. Okay, it can come in solid form or a liquid form or any other form or a smokable form. So it is true that alcohol didn't have such, you're quite right, actually. That aside, alcohol was common in India. It was not as uncommon because, again, it's a nationalist, especially Gandhi and Gandhian nationalists were much against alcohol, and they picketed alcohol places, and they were very puritanical. And so were the Christian missionaries. And so were the, other community groups such as Hindu Mahasabha or Muslim leagues. They were all against alcohol, and they all branded it a British thing. Yes, it was British. What was British was distilled alcohol. But fermented wine made from local things like mahua flower, the wild mahua flower, or coconut, or even rice, rice wine made in many parts of northeastern India. These were common.
That's been for like centuries, isn't it?
Yeah, centuries. Definitely, for centuries, and in some centuries it was, it depended. The technology didn't change much, although there were distillation. They have found old distillation pots in 300 AD, at archaeological sites in 300 AD, 400 AD in India. So some form of crude distillation was also taking place, of spirits. But most of the alcohol drunk was in fermented form. Usually from palm juice or coconut or, other whatever locally available fruits. It's true, the only people who didn't drink it very regularly were the upper caste Brahmins and one or two other merchant caste Baniyas. But apart from the upper caste, Hindus and upper caste Muslims, everybody else drank. When Alamgir, when Aurangzeb, the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb, he's a very divisive figure in the subcontinent because those who want a Hindu Rashtra, those who want a Hindu India, they claim that Mughals were all foreigners, which of course is nonsense. To that extent, even they are foreigners. But everybody is a foreigner. Only the indigenous people of India are Indian. So, but otherwise, Alamgir, he did bring about some Islamic laws within the Mughal emperor, which the others before him did not do. Okay, there was never, in any case, there was never a real Shariat ever imposed in the Mughal Empire. It never happened. But he did impose some laws. One of them was forbidding alcohol legally. Okay. And the only other time it's been done was in the 14th century when Alauddin Khilji who was not a Mughal emperor, he was a Sultan emperor, a Turkish, of the Turkish clans. He had, for some time, he had prevented alcohol because and for much the same reason. Not only because of religious reasons, but because, when where do people drink alcohol? Usually men in Indian society, in patriarchal societies, unless it was in ritual form, where women would also drink. Usually it was socially men drinking together in a room. And then they could very well be plotting. So he wanted to stop that, intrigues against the state and plotting. So this is one of the reasons you attack the Maikhana, the bars. You attack any drinking, communal drinking. All it did was, like it does today in today's Indian states where there is prohibition, it just drove the drinking underground. And in fact, one French traveler to our Alamgir's court, they were all merchants and they were traveling at this time, and some of them wrote, and some of the accounts are very, very famous. So he said that he himself, he was French, and he used to give a bottle of spirits to the chief imam at the court every day. And he said that he could guarantee that there is nobody in the entire empire who did not drink. He was giving a bottle of spirit to the chief imam himself. So apart from the emperor himself, who was a very austere man who didn't drink, and Aurangzeb, that he never used the empire's money for his own keeping. He used to make embroidery on the cloth caps. And with that, what he earned from that, he used for his personal upkeep. So he was very austere. He didn't use the empire's resources for his own lavish living, which was obviously very strange in an emperor. Anyway, so the emperor himself did not drink, but everybody else did. It's drinking alcohol is old. What the British did was something fundamental. They streamlined the production. So whereas every woman who collected some juice from the tree, palm tree, or the sugar cane, and would brew it, the men wouldn't brew it, the women did it. There were entire castes, communities of alcohol makers, where the man, and you will see paintings also, 18th century paintings are available if you go to the British Library, of the caste of women who are alcohol makers. So the men would actually put the handis or the vessels, earthen vessels, onto the tree, make a cut on the bark of the tree, collect the juice from the palm tree or the coconut tree. The women would take that juice and ferment it and brew it and make a wine. And usually the women also sold it. In certain communities, they sold it to everyone. So what this did was, it decentralized the production of alcohol. What happens when you decentralize the production of a commodity? The state cannot keep trace of it. If the state cannot keep trace of it, it cannot tax it. And if it does tax it, it cannot predict what tax will come. The taxes can never be predicted. They wanted a stable source of revenue. How will they do it? They first banned these fermented drinks. No, they first banned production of these fermented drinks. They said only some people can do it under license. And this license was auctioned to the highest bidder. So they didn't have any moral problem about alcohol, the British. So they said, okay, we license the trees, not the pots of liquor. They licensed the palm trees from which the juice came. So only some people then got monopoly over it. These were the Parsis, who were rich merchants and old collaborators of the East India Company. In Western India, that happened. In other parts, other rich people who could afford to buy these licenses from the government got it. So the caste occupation of these women and these people, they were completely criminalized at that. But it also means when you're taxing it, they're charging much more for the liquor because they're paying the government this. But even this was not enough for government. Then they began to issue licenses to produce alcohol by setting up distilleries themselves. At first, these were for the sahibs themselves in the army and everywhere. They were importing all their whiskey from Scotland and wherever else, Ireland, and a lot of vodka from Germany and all that, but it was expensive. So they set up some British merchants, they set up industries of making whiskey and rum and beer in India. Okay, from sugarcane, because the raw material is available here. Sugarcane is available. So they just started manufacturing. And the government gave, and then the government realized if it taxed these, then they get a lot of money. So they then criminalized all fermented drinks. And instead said you must distill them and sell them. And this distilled, it had a very particular name, country liquor. Have you heard of the word country liquor?
No.
In Hindustani, it was called desi.
Okay.
Have you heard of the term desi?
Yeah. That's a very common
Yeah.
term.
Now, and you know, it's a white spirit. It's just like a vodka. Okay. So what is this desi? Now, everything that was native to this country was called country. Like country ship is a local trading vessel that will not go beyond the ocean. It's a coastal trading vessel. Okay, a country ship. In the same way, country liquor was liquor that was produced in Hindustan, in the subcontinent. But this was not whiskey. Whiskey was one grade higher. So they called it's just a spirit that is manufactured from the same, either mahua juice or palm juice or from sugarcane, molasses. But not fermented, which could be done within households, distilled, which needs distillation, furnace. It needs a capital and organization, needs a factory, which the government inspectorate can come and put a stamp and tax. So that is how the British came to be associated with liquor, because gradually they did away with the system of fermented liquor being brewed. Even now you will find some fermented liquor and some communities, but they are all underground and they're criminalized and they are completely marginalized, which they were not in pre-British times. So this is how the British introduced not alcohol, but distilled spirits, which they could tax and make a lot of money from. It also changed the drinking habits of Indians. Instead of drinking natural fermented drinks, they began drinking distilled drinks, which are much more potent.
But also we see like lots of news that, people die from drinking this local, like alcohol. Is part of this problem is because it's gone now underground. So
yes,
there are lots of problem in terms of infrastructure.
Because it has been criminalized, that, these only happens in states which impose prohibition. Okay, so the rich, they pay bootleggers who smuggle it in proper bottles from other places. What do the poor do? They will have to buy locally made stuff. Now, earlier it used to be locally made fermented stuff, but now it's not. Now it's also distilled stuff, but they use methyl alcohol. They add a little bit of methyl alcohol. And if they misjudge the quantity they can use,
that's the poison.
Industrial alcohol, that's the poison. You'll go blind. So that is where it mostly comes from. Not the fermented stuff. The fermented stuff there is a lot of illegal fermented stuff, but as I said, it's not. You cannot refrigerate it. You cannot preserve it much. So it's cheaper. It's made immediately and drunk on the night. But if you want to sell it in bottles, or if you want to sell it to the urban poor, huge. We are talking of a huge bulk. That is industrial alcohol. And when it is corrupted,
that becomes it's like kind of street drugs.
It is a street drug. These days, it's in India. I was talking do you remember that conference on alcohol I organized and you met all those people?
I did, yeah.
So, I was talking to one of them and he said these days you get 5 rupee small pouches in plastic, like you get milk in small pouches, pasteurized milk from dairies. You get 5 rupee pouches of alcohol. And these are marketed to the teenage or homeless children on the streets of India.
Mm.
Because they cannot afford the more expensive pouches, which will be 100 rupees. Because homeless children also earn money on the streets by begging or by other little services like shoe cleaning or whatever. But they can buy a 5 rupee pouch, which will have maybe half a glass of spirit.
I mean, like why our humanity is like, so prone to get drunk? I mean, why they love being drunk? It just is because of like, I'm getting like more kind of philosophical here. Like, is it like the reality is so difficult? We just tend to forget.
Yeah, you're getting, and this is more in your line of thinking, because I am not, I am just an historian. I tell stories. I would find it really outside of my expertise to really answer this question. But since I began by saying everybody does require, in all centuries, as an historian, I know in all societies, there is some recreational substance. Not to. Well, yes, the truth is that we all want to go beyond ourselves. For that, some people travel, some people become spiritual, and they do go inside their minds to a different plane of existence. At least I believe that they do. I have never experienced it myself, but I'm perfectly willing to believe that some people do. In the same, but it's much easier to do it with a substance that helps you, that changes the chemistry of your brain. Why wouldn't you? Frankly, I don't see anything morally wrong with it.
No. I mean, but again, the price is from like, you're talking about 5 rupee to like, 1,000 pound. This like, this.
Oh, I have seen bottles of whiskey that are worth more than 1,000 pounds. So
1,000 pounds, yeah, I can see. So it like depends, like who is the consumer. So if you're at like bottom of the pile, the chances are you will buy those 5 rupee one. There will be a risk involved there as well. You might die.
Yes, but I think, first of all, I think they don't know the risk, the one who wants to have it. Then they might have something a little more expensive. But other thing, there comes a point when it doesn't matter, because, if you want that, like a gambler, for instance, if it's an addiction, a gambler, they gamble away everything, do they not? And it's also an equally ancient addiction. So it's after a point, your body gets addicted to it, and you cannot do without it.
And also, like, you don't care either that at one.
No, once you are addicted, it's like any other addiction, drugs or anything. You don't. I mean, there is no moral fiber. There's no question of a moral fiber. But before that, why do people do it? And there are some people who can manage it. They don't have to get drunk. They like to drink, but they do not get drunk. And that is the golden mean that I suppose we are aspiring for. It may not happen always, because, there's always a risk with these chemical substances. Any chemical or herbal substances, anything that changes the biochemistry of your brain, it's a risk. But then, if your reality is harsh enough, even if it isn't, even if it's just boring. I don't know about you, but I find myself drinking a lot more recreationally during the lockdown.
I watch films quite a lot, and I like, respect all those very good actors around the world. And one of them was like Seymour Hoffman, and he actually died because he was addicted to heroin, and he was buying drugs from the street basically. And then like in one day, he just like overshot himself and he died.
Again, I'm not a philosopher. Because I'm an historian, I would find another way of looking at it. Most of these recreational substances have been developed over time through chemical processes to become more potent and more addictive. Take the example of opium. Okay. Opium in itself, it's addictive, but you can have a little bit of opium every day, and stay perfectly normal. Yes, you will want it every day. You'll get addicted, but you'll stay normal. But when the essential component of opium is taken out of it, and you make heroin out of it, morphine.
Morphine, yeah.
You make morphine out of it. It's distilled opium. Right? You've taken the active substance out of it, active component out of it, synthesized it, and it's morphine. Morphine is also very useful. You're in a great deal of pain, you have morphine in every operation, after every major surgical operation. I'm sure they used to give morphine. I think they still do. Patients who are dying, and to assuage their pain in palliative care, morphine is given as well. It's used medically, clinically, to a great extent. Fine. What is heroin? Heroin is an even more distilled version of morphine. So what you're doing on the bench, on the chemistry bench, is to take the active ingredient, make it potent, then take the active ingredient of this, make it even more potent, to the degree when you're increasing the potency. And along with increasing the potency, you're also increasing the dangerousness and the addiction level of that commodity. And I think that is the problem. Opium in itself may not have been, it was a problem. And you know about China and the opium wars.
Yeah.
But that was a problem of quantity. And if you reduce the quantity, if you manage the quantity, that was a problem of greed of the East India Company, to put it bluntly. But if the quantity were managed carefully, then it may not have been this kind of a problem. But I think the chemical revolution, it has done a lot for humanity. But it has also, like any scientific, like any scientific trajectory, it has also enabled this, ingredients are getting more and more sophisticated, like coca leaves. Now, coca leaves would be just, as you know, it's part of their culture.
Yeah.
Right? In South America, it's part of their culture. Now you're making crack cocaine. You distilled the active ingredient, you're making cocaine. Fine. On the streets, they want to make even more profit. They're making crack cocaine. They want to make it even more, then they will add something to the crack cocaine to make it more profitable. And it is that which is going to harm you. Not the coca leaf per se, unless you have a whole tree of coca leaves at one go. You see the problem?
Yeah.
So alcohol ditto, fermented liquids, fermented alcohol, it's fine.
I used to do lots of classic literature, and one of the books, the earliest memories, like Homer, the blind poet, his Odyssey, and in one event with the Odyssey is his journey, this fellow's warrior called Odysseus, and then when he was coming back home after the war, and his journey was disrupted. So each time they stopped somewhere, and then they ended up with something bad. In one event, they ended up in an island, and they found that there are some plants called lotus eaters, and all they ended up with eating those lotus eaters. This is today's version is just like opium, and that disrupted their journey for 10 years. They lost 10 years. Perhaps they were bored after the war.
And in fact, the lotus eaters has become a phrase,
is it?
An idiom in English language to signify, people who are addicted usually to opium. Opium also, of course, became very fashionable. Not just opium, laudanum, which was its derivative and used clinically. For Victorian women who had migraines were usually given laudanum. It was a component of the medicine chest in Britain, in British medicine chests from the mid-19th century onwards, right up to, I think, 1910s, 15s. And opium itself, have you heard of Thomas De Quincey's Confessions of an Opium Eater?
Yeah.
So that was also it became very fashionable in high society in London because it was an empire. Like tea was fashionable and expensive, and then it became common and no longer quite so fashionable. But opium had that. In the same way, I think that cocaine has it today in today's elite society. You must have heard of the reports that I see in the papers every now and then, that if you inspect the sewage in London, the sewage water in London, the quantity of cocaine there is enormous.
Oh my God. I never knew that.
So
is it like people are dumping cocaine, the street cocaine?
No, a lot of people, usually, City of London people or, high society people in London. These are in the elite boroughs as well. They are consuming cocaine on a regular basis, and so it's in the sewage. So
that's very interesting. You are quite expert about the history of all these things. So like one of the things we'll try to also do, like cover this like current pandemic. We both came from like subcontinent. You were from India, I'm from Bangladesh. Both our countries affected seriously. The amount of close friends and family members I lost, just a staggering number. These are very, very young people we are talking about. So these are successful professionals, like the teachers, bankers, like civil servant. I mean, these are we're talking about 41, 43, 55 years old people. Gone.
Yes. In the first wave in India and in the subcontinent more generally, it were the working classes who died, usually the urban poor. In the second wave, it's much more ferocious, and the mutants, what they're calling the Indian mutant, is it's more infectious. It's also more deadly. It's affected the middle classes. Middle classes in India are very protected and they're very privileged. But this time it has got the middle classes.
And even I saw some of the pictures, like people were actually sharing bed, hospital bed they're sharing. In a single bed, there are 2-3 people.
Yes. Yes, the hospitals are quite overwhelmed, but so are the crematoriums.
Yeah, I saw that picture as well.
The crematoriums are overwhelmed. And in fact, one state, Uttar Pradesh, where the outbreak has been one of the worst, it has already passed a law saying that people can cremate their dead domestically, which means in their own courtyards.
I mean, it's quite a funny story. Like during this, the Black Death in the Europe, one of the popular profession during that time was becoming a priest. Because priests were doing lots of, this last rite, when people die, doing those rites. But at the same time, since these people are needed quite a lot, and since they were on the ground, they were also dying from this Black Death as well.
Yeah.
So that means they need to recruit more and more. So historically, during that time, becoming priest is quite a rigorous process. But since you need more this supply of the priest, they kind of, got rid of some of those, all those strict criteria to become priest. That's a fascinating story. So obviously, I think India, Bangladesh are facing similar kind of things because both countries are very religious and they tend to, go through all those rituals.
Yes, they are religious, but there's also a grim practicality that I have always noticed in India. And I think the government's giving the permission to cremate the dead bodies in their own backyards or courtyards. Very often a priest will not be available. So for Hindus, Hindus cremate their dead. And that is also a new as in 100, maybe 150-year-old trend. Usually only the few upper caste communities cremated with the full rituals. And the others, because it still is expensive to cremate, because you have to collect the wood. The usual thing to do was to dispose of the dead, either bury the dead or dispose of them in the river if there's pandemic. And in fact, when there were a lot of dead, that is what happened, even in upper caste. Have you heard of Jim Corbett, the conservationist and tiger hunter?
Yeah.
One of his most famous hunting stories, bear with me, I know this is a digression.
Yeah.
One of his most famous hunting stories was of Kumaun, of the leopard of Rudraprayag, of one particular region in the Kumaun Hills in the Himalayas. And so a leopard turned man-eater, and then he was called as a big game hunter. And he had to track the leopard for many days before he shot it. Because it had to be shot. But he had an interesting anecdote. He said that it became a man-eater after the year of the cholera epidemic. Why? Because so many people died in the cholera epidemic. And we are talking of the Himalayan, lower reaches of the Himalayan belt in India. There just weren't enough cremation or burial grounds, so they were thrown over the ridges. Mountain village would throw dead bodies over the ridges by way of disposing. And there the carcasses would lie. And of course, the leopard, it's easy food for the leopard. They don't have to hunt. They can just eat human flesh. And that is how they got a taste for human flesh.
Oh my God.
And once the throwing the dead stopped, once the pandemic was over, the dead were no longer thrown like that. Then the leopard had to go to the villages, not the village. Usually the leopard hunted in the forests where the women went to pick grass for firewood.
Oh.
Women and children. So once it couldn't get dead bodies, it went for live bodies hunting. And that was after the and so there is a grim practicality. When you cannot cremate the bodies, you can dispose of them. And there was, and you could always, anyway, ritually among Hindus, it is anyway permitted to, you're not supposed to cremate children or babies. You're supposed to put them in a shroud and release them in the river.
I'm fascinated with the story, isn't it? So that can bring like another question, like, like things like, how do these pandemics end? Or do they actually end physically? Or it just stays with us forever? Not the same intensity, but it just there.
It's an interesting question, and there's no easy answer to that. So far as some diseases are concerned, they have been eradicated, simply pandemics, because of the vaccine, like smallpox. It doesn't exist anymore. It was a huge burden at one time to mankind. The vaccine eradicated it. There are others like TB or diphtheria, which are bacterial. Smallpox is a virus. Is a virus.
Yeah.
This is a diphtheria or TB. These are also epidemic diseases, or scarlet fever. These are epidemic, but these were controlled through antibiotics.
Okay.
So one way is through antibiotics, the other way is through vaccines. What does happen is the virus, if you're talking of the virus won't go away. It's around. What also happens is that the virus often loses its potency. And the usual trend is that when a virus, the more it circulates and the more it mutates. And the more it mutates, the more it becomes less virulent, less potent. And so then these pandemics become only for the poor. So because public health is also matters. Cholera, for instance, it's waterborne. We know they're waterborne. And even before you get into the antibiotics end of the story, it's only the poor who will have cholera. Now, where their own drinking water is mixed with sewage. It happens in many developing countries even now. They may not even call it cholera these days. I would imagine that, public health doctors, at least in India, would write it off as gastroenteritis. But it's cholera. We know it's cholera. It comes at a certain time in the monsoon. It overwhelms the population for some time in certain areas. They don't get noticed because they're limited to the poor. It becomes a disease of the poor.
Like just one side story here. I teach United Nations peacekeeping, and a couple of years ago there was a peacekeeping operation in Haiti, and the camps was close to the river, and these peacekeepers actually came from Nepal.
I know that story.
You know the story, and that they're drinking water, and then I think they got cholera.
It was alleged that they brought cholera to Haiti.
Okay.
In fact, the British called Bengal the home of cholera.
But is it true? Is it?
No, of course not. I mean, cholera was prevalent there, but it could be prevalent anywhere else. It's true that cholera went from India to Europe. The first big epidemic was 1817, another in 1820. all the way from Russia to all the way, in fact. Another really major was in 1830. So yes, in 19th century, they did go. But it's also, once they cleaned it up, once they cleaned up their drinking water, piped water, they didn't have the epidemics. And yeah, the Haiti example is very, very, very interesting, because the Haitians claimed that the Nepal peacekeeping force, the Gorkha peacekeeping force, had brought cholera with them. And it was because of the water. I mean, cholera is waterborne. But it's interesting how a disease becomes localized and ethnicized because of this.
But also politicized as well with this, this coronavirus. We see Trump was...
all epidemics are political.
So Trump was calling it like Chinese virus. So as if China, only China can produce this kind of virus. Just one more thing I really want to unpack here, this viral versus bacterial, and both can be pandemic as well. Which one is more dangerous, or do you think that both can be as bad as the other one?
Both can be. It depends on that particular virus or that particular bacteria. So we have antibacterial antibiotics. We don't have antivirals to that extent. We have some, but not. But as we have more and more viral infection, if we get more of them, then I suppose we will develop more antivirals. One example is the AIDS epidemic. When it first came in the US in the 1980s, first of all, the virus itself was very, very virulent. Everybody died. And it was a shock. And getting it meant that a death sentence in 2 or 3 years. Now with antiretrovirals that have come up as a result of research, and a lot of research, because why was there so much money? Because rich Americans and rich people in developed countries were affected by it. A lot of money went into AIDS research. They developed retrovirals. They developed, these which if you take one tablet a day, even if you are HIV positive, you will not get AIDS for the next 20 years. So you can manage your condition and live. Like at one time in the 1920s, diabetes was a death sentence. If you get a type 2 diabetes or even type 1 diabetes, you die in a few years. Okay. Today, it's no longer a death sentence. It's managed. It's managed by controlling your hormones, your insulin, which is a hormone. So you just inject. These days, you don't even inject. You can take pills of insulin to manage your sugar levels, right? It's not a death sentence if you have diabetes. In fact, South Asians are very prone to it. I mean, my blood is tested every year because my brother is diabetic and, my blood sugar is high. I'm not diabetic yet, but I will be, I'm sure, in some time. Once the research into it went that way, and once medicines were developed, HIV is no longer feared to that extent. Also, I think, if I remember correctly, I read something about the virus itself becoming less virulent. It's the AIDS virus we have now is not as virulent as the one we saw in...
Is that part of that kind of discussion about herd immunity?
No. For herd immunity, you will need, about 70% of the population to get the disease and get over it.
Okay. Is there any famous or notorious bacterial pandemic in history?
Cholera.
Cholera was the bacterial one. Okay.
TB. TB killed a lot of people. TB till the...
So if you go back to 1918-20, which is Spanish flu, that's viral.
That was a virus. That was influenza, which is flu. And yes, that was a virus.
And it killed almost 50 million people. That's a huge number.
Yeah. You see, because the war had ended. So there was worldwide mobility. Do you know why it's called the Spanish flu?
I think you told me that, but you can just tell it again to
because Spain was the one country in Europe which didn't censor its newspapers. All the other countries censored their newspapers. So when it moved from all the way from Hong Kong, nobody wrote about it. It killed more than a few million in India as well.
Wow.
And so it killed people everywhere, as you say, around 50 million. And it's only because the Spanish newspapers were allowed to print it, allowed to talk about it, that they first wrote about it. And because they first wrote about it, they became associated, Spain became associated with it. And so it was called the Spanish flu.
Does it mean like they were blamed for it, or just like?
No, I don't think there was no such.
No. Giving a name.
Giving it a name, and I think the world was still preoccupied with the horrors of the war itself. And I think death became normalized, which is why the Spanish flu went under the radar for scholars as well. Lately there has been some writing, but it has been ignored to a great extent. The Spanish flu itself.
Can you learn from the history, to understand these pandemics?
Because can we learn from history is again a philosophical question, and again it's beyond my expertise.
Or why history of pandemics are important?
Because we assume that human beings are rational. And if we see patterns, you're right. If we see pattern, we can understand them. So far as I am concerned, I write because I want to understand the politics of it. I want to understand how power functions, how power defines that disease and its spread and its treatment. That's why I would write a history of pandemic. As for whether we can learn from it, yes, of course we can learn from it. But it also depends on whether we want to learn from it and who wants to learn from it. We cannot understand pandemics except with relation to human beings and politics and the use of power.
Also, any particular those pandemics, who wrote those stories? That's also important. From what power position?
Like any history, of course, that's important. Of course, we know that we will not be able to retrieve some voices, but that is a historian's lot. We have to make do with what sources we have. They're also important because epidemics are determined not by the virus itself per se, or at least if they are, that is only to a certain extent. The rest of it is determined by entirely human factors, such as the politics of how state manages it, the politics of borders, the politics of quarantine. And all of 19th century was about the politics of quarantine. The plague was solved through the quarantine in Europe. Britain has never wanted quarantine. Britain has always had a more laissez-faire policy than continental Europe. Historically, Europe has always had quarantine. That is how it stopped the plague. But that is how it tried to stop cholera. And it battled diplomatically with Britain and the British Empire because they didn't want to stop it. Because then, as now, Britain had investment in 2/3 of the trade that went through the Suez Canal. So you can't do a quarantine to stop cholera epidemics, for instance, in 19th century. Anyway, so that is one part of it. So that's when I say that I can bet you anything that if history is any indication, there are cultures of medicine, historical cultures of medicine, then Britain will not impose a lockdown. And of course, Britain did impose a lockdown, but it kept its borders open much longer than Europe.
That's true.
And that's the reason, because historically, it's not just one government. It's also that the medical officials and the medical culture of Britain is not impose quarantine, but to impose laissez-faire and then sanitize as they go along. In this case, not just sanitize, but also vaccinate once the vaccination has come about. The lessons to learn about epidemics is they can be controlled. It depends on the will of the state.
So,
and you can see the example in India.
So this idea about this laissez-faire, which is basically capitalistic society we are talking about here.
Yes.
Profit, the money. Yes. And we can see lots of protest on our streets as well. Everyone wants to open up everything, do business and then make money and make profit and all those things. But at the same time, the understanding about this pandemic, what does it mean? I mean, and what it does, those understandings were kind of, put on a kind of face-off situation with this like profit-making enterprise.
But also the government itself will become, government needs, unless there is economic activity, the government will not get taxes. I mean, I understand the reason for lockdown. I also understand the reason why the government feels it cannot infinitely lock down an economy. No government can. So there has to be a calibration process. And because this virus is new, it is idiosyncratic, it is mutating. And because it's new, nobody quite knows how it will mutate. Nobody knows the pathway. Okay, so these are all risk factors. And so it will be very difficult to calibrate when to open, when to lock down. So, I mean, I feel strange that I've been put in a position where I have to defend this government, or indeed any government. But I can see that it's a very difficult task to calibrate when to lock down, when to open.
Because people will die, isn't it, at the end of the day?
Yes, people will die, but locking down will stop it, but locking down will also stop all economic activity, which will also affect people. And it also affects the poorest people. We middle classes, we're even getting, I've got a solid wages, also the pandemic. My students have not, they work in bars.
That's true. But do you think like the countries like UK or like, this like OECD countries who are developed countries, they're in an advantageous position because they can borrow money from banks because the banks are quite, willing to.
No, OECD countries have advantages in every case. They don't even have to do research in vaccines, although they have done it. They can just let others get on with the research and buy it.
And just buy it, yeah.
UK doesn't even have the capability to manufacture the vaccines. Yes, it has done the research and the government has paid for it. But it doesn't have to manufacture. It just outsources it to India.
Yeah.
And India will manufacture it by the tons and send it here. So,
I mean, especially like countries like Bangladesh who, sometimes they need to also lock down, and then you can see the outcry because it's such a, subsistence economy. If people don't work, there's nothing there. There's nothing from the government. And the problem is like countries like Bangladesh also, since their credit rating is so low, they cannot borrow money from the banks either. So it's like, lots of multi-layered drawbacks if you are a poor country when you're facing like pandemic.
It's not just a drawback. It's that the entire international world order is against you. And it's patently unjust and unequal. It's not a drawback. It's a systemic inequality and injustice.
In terms of political science perspective, it's a like tragedy of the commons. And when you have this tragedy of the commons, it has to be dealt collectively, isn't it? But with this pandemic, one thing we saw, I mean, it totally exposed and how selfish we were. And then everyone is trying to either, to start this race to get the vaccination fast, or someone is trying to hoard it, or someone is trying to hack it from someone else. So all kind of bad faith politics about this pandemic.
See, pandemics will reflect power politics. Pandemics will not change our politics. It will only reflect what we have already. So if we have based a society on individual gratification, then why should a pandemic suddenly, and how can a pandemic suddenly change that? The lesson for a future pandemic is that we will get the pandemic we deserve, and it will reflect our society. So if we have a selfish society geared towards our own gratification, then the pandemic will also be unequal and will favor the elite and the rich. I mean, there is no greater truth that will come from the pandemic, unfortunately.
Albert Camus, when he was writing this famous novel, The Plague, and he was saying that, with the plague or without plague, it doesn't matter. The absurdity of being human is still a problem. It's still a problem. And
no, I don't think the human condition is the problem. I have a more optimistic view. I think it is the politics that is a problem, and I think we can change the politics of humankind. We are not just individuals. We can be collective and still thrive, and still be creative, and we can build societies that take care of everyone. Every political conviction that I have is beaten and has lost. I have lost every political battle I've ever waged. But I still believe this. If not in my lifetime, then in another time. But it will come. Because human beings are fundamentally compassionate and empathetic creatures. We fundamentally thrive within society, not out of it. So when Maggie Thatcher said there is no society, she was not naming a reality. She was naming an aspiration.
Because that's the thing, the people.
But that is not the aspiration of most people. I still don't believe it is.
What will be your advice for our students? I mean,
it's what I tell all my students. Be brave. Whether it is challenging, whether it is writing, be brave. If you're a coward, you will never, your intellect will not flourish. It might scare you to be brave, but you have to be brave.
Push
it's
you.
For an intellectual life, courage and bravery is the most important thing. Everything else is secondary.
Thank you, Nandini.
Votre toast, je peux vous le rendre, Seigneur.